Dr. Kathleen Higgins is a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of several books on Nietzsche, music, and the history of philosophy, and editor or co-editor of several others on such topics as non-Western philosophy, Nietzsche, German idealism, aesthetics, ethics, erotic love, and the philosophy of Robert C. Solomon. She has been president of the American Society for Aesthetics, and she is the recipient of the Silver Spurs Centennial Teaching Award at the University of Texas. Watch her speak now on the subject of Camus, the Plague, and Our Plague.
Hi, I think I qualify for Nerd Night. I teach philosophy at the University of Texas. And one of the things I frequently teach is existentialism, and therefore I frequently teach Camus. I was a little bit surprised, though I shouldn't have been, when after the lockdown started, I started hearing all kinds of coverage on the news and radio shows and things like that about how popular the plague had become. In some ways, you would think that this wouldn't be popular at this particular juncture, but I think it's really quite good that it is. Camus wrote his novel about the plague, having done a lot of research about actual plagues. But one of the things he had in mind was the way people responded to Nazi Germany during the occupation of France. And what he talks about is the kinds of responses people have to a situation that's entirely bizarre. Just to say something about his general point of view, he's convinced that the world isn't naturally humane and just, that if we're going to make the world humane and just, it's a project for human beings. And he actually doesn't think there's ever going to be an end point to that. He thinks there are always going to be things that people need to do to try to fight against injustice and inhumanity. So this is a never-ending pursuit, and he thinks we should be realistic about that. But precisely by engaging in this pursuit, he thinks we can find meaning in our lives. This is a big question when you're living through the context of something completely disruptive, like World War II, or like a plague, or like COVID-19. And I think in a lot of ways, his novel is asking, what's the best way to cope with these kinds of completely disruptive situations? The story told in The Plague is, well, we actually don't know throughout the book who is telling us a story until really pretty late in the game. And that's because the narrator says that he wants to be anonymous. He wants to be as objective as possible. In fact, we're not surprised to discover when we finally do, he's the doctor who has been present in virtually all of the scenes. So in a way, it's no mystery. But he tells a story with the idea of giving us a kind of doctor's account, or a kind of symptomology of what's going on as people confront the fact that they're living in a city that has been locked down because of plague. And some of the things that he talks about are the psychological responses. And I think many of those are some of the things that we might relate to currently in our situation. The first reaction that is very common is disbelief, even among a lot of physicians. At least Ryu, the doctor, is aware that he's seen this kind of symptomology before, and so he's pretty certain what he's dealing with, but he's a little bit hesitant to really force the issue. And it takes a while, even when the doctors have come to an agreement that this is clearly what they're dealing with, it takes a while for the civic authorities to get with the program as well. So there's this kind of never land where you're not sure whether this is something to take seriously or not. And that's followed by a period of forced inactivity, because a lot of activities that were previously available no longer are. I think we are somewhat familiar with that. And people start to find that their experience is flattened. Part of it is that they're constantly thinking about things they would like to do, but then they realize, oh, I can't do that. Or they start to form a plan, and then some features of it start to seem really kind of unworkable. And the result of this is that time starts to have a really odd feel. I suspect that many of us have noticed that in our own situation currently, the fact that you don't really have any idea when it's going to be over. So it's a little bit hard to plan. And a lot of times, if you think about anything that isn't the present, well, your mind drifts to the past, and then you become maybe a little bit resentful that you can't do things you did before. Or maybe you just feel cut off from a lot of people. I think the fact that you can't see very many people at a time, and often not at all if they're at any distance, or need to be isolated, is something that affects us too. And so time starts to contract into the present, but it's not an enthusiastic present. It's a kind of whiling away the time, I guess would be the best way of putting it. And one of the results eventually is apathy. People get kind of numb to the whole thing. Maybe for a little while you can see some novelty in it, but after a while it just gets dreary and people become exhausted. Now, I think what's interesting about this is these are really characteristics of grief. When people are grieving, they do pretty much, well, they have pretty much the same kind of reaction. They feel initially that they can't believe that they've lost something so precious to them. And they also feel unable to do things. The kind of usual habits that they have don't seem applicable anymore. And the result is that they start to find their time a little bit strange as well. They don't really feel that time is what it once was. In fact, it seems that the future doesn't mean much because most of the things that used to give life purpose don't seem really to apply. And of course, they're missing their loved ones if they're grieving for a person. But I think in our case, it's important for us to notice just on how many levels most of us actually are grieving. Some of us are grieving for our jobs, quite literally. And many of us who are fortunate enough to have jobs are grieving for more normal circumstances in which you can interact with people as you customarily have. Many people have lost members of their families or other people close to them. And in addition to that, I think there's a kind of vague anticipatory grief. It's kind of a term that's used in reference to grieving in advance for something. And I think many of us have the feeling that, well, maybe this disease is something that we're vulnerable to. So maybe we're grieving for ourselves. And we certainly don't know that anyone we care about is necessarily safe from it either. So on all kinds of different levels, we're experiencing grief. And I think that one of the reasons that Camus' novels speak so directly to us is for that reason. One of the things that I think is often noted when people analyze grief is that it's profoundly isolating. And of course, literally, when you're in a context where you're locked down and not able to see many people, naturally that feels isolating. But there's also a kind of isolation just from feeling grief. I think this is a good picture to illustrate the point. This is a Munch painting called Death in the Sick Room. And you see all these different people basically near a deathbed, and they're all completely caught up in their own reflections. They can't really bond even with people who are right there. And the challenge in grief is really to reconnect with other people. This, I think, is very much the kind of thing that Camus is concerned with. He thinks that the real solution to grief is solidarity, to join with others and somehow try to make things more just and more humane, even in circumstances that make that difficult. A very small part is played in the novel by a magistrate who he seems kind of clueless where human beings are concerned. And yet he has a young son who dies in a pretty horrifying scene. Fortunately, he's not present for the death. And he's upset later on because he's been kept in quarantine for a long, long time after his son has died. Eventually he gets out, but he decides to return to where he's been in quarantine in order to help others. And he comments, "I think it will make me feel closer to my son." I think this sums up really what Camus sees the solution to be, that when we're grieving, we feel that we need to attend to caring about those that we're grieving, if we're grieving people, or attend to what we're going to do in place of circumstances that we're grieving as well. But Camus thinks the thing to do is to band with others, to somehow see if the situation can be improved. And that might, in fact, be a way of grieving, because this magistrate sees helping others as a way of memorializing his son. And interestingly enough, the doctor too is memorializing. He in fact loses his wife toward the end of the novel, and she's been away at a sanitarium for a long time in advance of this. In a way, you can see the whole novel as presented as somehow getting in touch with the social world, honoring personal loss and the loss of everyone by making a memorial to it. I'll close with one of the great lines from the novel that is mentioned very much at the end. Camus thinks there's more to admire than despise in human beings. So even in times of tribulation, it's still possible to notice the way many people rise to the occasion. And I think Camus thinks that's the best thing to dwell on as we try to make our situation better. Thanks.
Okay, so it is time for questions. And let's see if we have any in from the Twitch stream. I know that I had one that I put into the stream, and it was, can you tell us about any other literary works that might offer models for dealing with the grief that we are collectively experiencing?
Ah, that's a very good question. It's kind of collective grief. Sometimes I think movies are helpful in this connection. Well, and in one way, I mean, this is kind of an off-the-wall suggestion, but Solaris, which is about a man who gets sent to a space station where a lot of people have been freaking out. And one of the reasons they're freaking out is they keep seeing appearances of their dead relatives as if they're alive. And they get so drawn to these hallucinations that their life starts to fall apart. I think that that's kind of exploration of the kind of feeling. And sometimes I think literature can help by just drawing us further into what's unusual about this frame of mind. Constant Gardener, I think in a way is that too. A man mourns his wife who has been killed by finding out more about the project that made her a target and taking that project on as his own. I think that's another one I'd recommend.
Lovely, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I see another question that might be a good one for our discussion right now. It seems relevant. Do you think everything being digital now hurts or helps with the idea of creating solidarity?
I think it does both. The fact that everything is digital, well, I mean, one of the things that's wonderful about the fact of digital connection is we can, you know, in effect, see each other and do a lot of things synchronously in a way that not that long ago wouldn't have been possible at all. And I think that's wonderful. But it does create a, I don't know, it's perhaps it's that it makes one feel connected with other people, but in a way that one doesn't have much confidence in, because you know that you're still, you know, sitting in your house and doing the routine. And so it's just kind of occasionally going forth to see the rest of the world and not fully being a part of it. But I think the fact that it enables so many things, I mean, that's, one has to sort of get past the fact that this is an odd way of relating to other people. And teaching, I did notice that, you know, like at first it was very weird to teach via Zoom, but after a while, it seemed like having a conversation. Um, the interface wasn't really the focus after a point. So maybe that's the best way for us to connect in these virtual ways.
Yes, I think there is a lot of hope in that perspective. Speaking of, I think this might be our last question, but we have several good ones, so it's a little difficult to pick. One of the things that I'm just going to call it. Rollo May would say our basic nature is good. Camus seems to have a different view. Which is the better starting point for dealing with grief?
Actually, I think Camus has the same view. I mean, I think that he's being understated in the role of the doctor, but certainly there are a lot of people that behave terribly when bad things are happening to them. But the whole point of his novel is to show people one way or another, even if they're not enthusiastic at the beginning, finding their way to banding together to improve things. And they each do it in their own way. And he holds this up as admirable, even if there are these little kind of quirky things that need to be done. And, you know, somebody rises to that occasion. So I think he agrees with me.
Excellent. It's always good to end on a note of accord. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your talk.